all the prosperity that we've experienced as a civilization, that was born out of the fossil fuel industry and heavy industry that built our whole economy. And I want the rest of the world, the developing world who hasn't yet had that privilege, to also share in the bounty of energy. And the key to doing all that is unlocking wind and solar. The only question is, how fast can we get there?
With the promise of zero carbon energy storage on the horizon, what might be possible when energy is so abundant and cheap, it's nearly free? Could we see a reindustrialization powered by clean energy? My guest today is Dr. Justin Briggs. He's building a battery he believes could cleanly power the world's heaviest industries.
Wind and solar are, for the first time, the cheapest form of primary energy on Earth. And our thermal batteries store that energy.
And coming up later in the show, we'll learn how a group using autonomous underwater robots are working to solve the unethical practices used in extracting essential battery minerals.
We don't want to simply solve one environmental problem in exchange for another.
Stick with us as we examine the importance of building better batteries that can power our energy economy, the problems we face with current mineral mining practices, and what it will take to power our world's heavy industries entirely with clean energy. The only way to solve our biggest problems is to have the audacity to try. Welcome to In the Arena with Evan Baehr.
All right, some people would argue that solving the battery storage challenge is potentially the silver bullet for one of the Earth's greatest challenges we face right now. Make the case for that.
Yeah. If you could solve energy storage, it would turn the biggest resource and opportunity that we have at our disposal, which is low-cost electricity from wind and solar, into a dispatchable resource, one that you could use by snapping your fingers, not just when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. And we saw that transforming every single industry, from the built environment to transportation to the electric grid to the manufacturing sector. Because if you can turn that electricity into on-demand power and on-demand heat, you can do anything with it. So if you could just make wind and solar electricity dispatchable and on-demand, you would basically solve every other major challenge in climate and energy.
So basically, there are times when the consumption is really high. So on a really hot day, and ACs are running, or in the dead of winter when heat is running, and maybe the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. So as great as renewables are, if we can't store that energy somewhere to use when it's not producing, it is a challenge to run a grid based on that.
Exactly. And the same goes for the industrial sector as well, which is actually an even bigger problem from an energy standpoint than the electric grid. More primary energy is used in the manufacturing sector than in the electric sector. And they have the exact same problem there. You want to run a factory, you're manufacturing textiles or automotive parts or chemicals or food and beverage, you need reliable energy around the clock. It doesn't matter if it's nighttime or daytime, if it's windy or not, you need energy. And so the same exact problem applies there. And so industrial energy storage is equally important.
Enter Antora. The problem you're trying to solve is there is a lot of nearly free energy being generated by solar and wind. On the demand side, there are people who have a real bottom line to hit, especially in industrials, are looking at their energy costs. They need a cheap, reliable solution. And you guys wanted to build a magic box in the middle that can receive that energy when it's being produced and can be pulled from when people need it. So sounds kind of simple.
Yeah.
Tell us about what you came up with to put in that box.
Yeah, it is kind of simple. And actually that was part of the core design criteria when we started the company is simplicity. So after evaluating a bunch of different ways to store energy, we thought the best solution was something very simple. So basically what we're doing is taking cheap stuff and getting it hot. That's all we do. So our cheap stuff is solid blocks of carbon. So think like pencil lead, like graphite. And this stuff is extremely cheap and extremely abundant. It's already produced in the sort of 30 million tons per year quantities for other industries. And we can just take these big blocks and resistively heat them when there's that excess electricity. So you got a windy day in the middle of Kansas, you got a sunny day in the middle of Southern California. You take that electricity and you use it to resistively heat the carbon, just like your toaster heats up a piece of toast. But we heat these carbon blocks to very high temperatures, so they're actually over 1,500 degrees Celsius. And at these temperatures, the carbon is literally glowing like a light bulb. Same physical principle, thermal radiation coming off of it. But of course, you don't want to lose that heat, so you wrap it in thermal insulation, so you keep that heat in, just like your coffee thermos keeps your coffee hot. And then here's the fun part. When you want to extract that energy and discharge the thermal battery, you can open a little door or a little shutter in that insulation, which allows that thermal glow to escape and be released. And then you can use that beam of high-intensity thermal radiation to do one of two things: either directly deliver industrial process heat or create electricity and deliver that to the customer.
How do you explain coming up with something that's actually pretty simple? Like, lots of smart people working on this before. The design principle of starting simple, not particularly novel.
Yeah.
What happened?
I think the reason is that the solution is simple in the end, but there's a lot of subtlety that went into making it work. So if you just, on face value, said, we're gonna take a solid block of material and heat it up and then later pull energy out of it, that sounds really simple, but there are actually a lot of challenges to doing that. It doesn't just work off the bat. So we had to work through a bunch of issues that came, a bunch of challenges, and we actually even tried to kill the technology. We said, let's try to find all the fatal flaws, all the weaknesses. Let's put this in front of every smart person we can find and ask them to prove to us that it's wrong, and let's try to kill it ourselves. And we couldn't kill it through that process, but through that process, it evolved and changed and got stronger, and the technology that we have today emerged, which is still fundamentally a simple technology, but there are also some key nuances.
Walk me through those two sort of product uses turn by turn. First is industrial heat. How does that piece work, and what kind of efficiencies are you looking at in that transfer process?
Yeah. So on the industrial heat side, we actually have an extremely efficient product, which is pretty exciting. So because we're turning electricity into heat and storing it as heat, and that process is virtually 100% efficient. You know, turning electricity into heat is very, very cheap and very efficient. And then we're storing it as heat in a well-insulated container, and then we're delivering the heat. We're doing something very simple, and that whole process has a round-trip efficiency of above 90%.
So you put in 100 units and you get out 90.
Exactly, over 90. So very, very efficient. And that helps drive the economics because almost all that energy input is delivered to the customer as useful heat. On the electricity side, our efficiency is lower, and that's because converting the stored heat back into electricity incurs a big efficiency penalty. And this is a fundamental thermodynamic limitation. Anytime you're trying to convert heat into work or electricity, you have to pay a price in efficiency. And so we pay that same price. We've developed a technology to do this very efficiently, and that technology is called thermophotovoltaics. It's basically like a solar photovoltaic, like a solar panel, that absorbs this thermal radiation and converts it to electricity, just like a solar cell absorbs sunlight and converts it to electricity, but this is absorbing the thermal radiation. So we've developed a TPV technology that can do that with over 40% conversion efficiency. So that's a far cry from above 90%, which is what we can do on the heat side, but it's still much more efficient than what had been done in the past with this technology, and I think opens up the technology space.
When I think about energy consumption, I'm mostly, as a layperson, thinking about transportation and consumer use. I think industrials might be close to a third. Would you sketch the sort of overall energy consumption landscape for us?
So I like to think about it in terms of emissions, which is not a one-to-one match for energy use because there are non-energy emissions. But if you look globally at the big picture, the manufacturing sector accounts for over 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is just a staggering number. So that 30% comes from three main sources, if you really simplify it down, and that's industrial heat, industrial electricity, and industrial chemistry. And the heat and the electricity part together forms the majority of that manufacturing-related emission. So that is the single biggest bucket of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and that's why we're tackling it. We said, if we're gonna start a company and solve a problem, let's make it the biggest, hardest problem that no one else is working on, and that was exactly industrial energy.
Give me a vision inside these factories. What's happening that uses so much heat and electricity?
A quintessential example would be chemicals manufacturing. So you've got some feedstock materials, and you want to convert those into some other products, and you need to heat them up to a certain temperature. So, for example, right now, all across the US, natural gas is being burned in a natural gas burner, which usually boils steam, and then that steam is delivered through a tube to some process and heats that and delivers thermal energy, heat, to that process so that it can operate at the right temperature for some bond to break or something to evaporate or something to dry out. So it's all sorts of different processes that can occur, but they're all driven by delivering industrial heat. At the same time, all of these processes have electric equipment running. So maybe there's a compressor running that needs to be powered by electricity. And so typically an industrial site has really big thermal demand and really big electrical demand.
So in terms of when you guys are doing this SWOT analysis of how to save the world and building your company, which let's get back to that. That's super cool. And you said, okay, if someone found a way to store energy from renewables cheaply, and then most of what we put in came out, and it wasn't really hard or dangerous to create this thing, that would be an amazing business. Obviously, that's true. Then you actually look at the science, and I would imagine you'd seen, wow, there's all these really smart people with PhDs from fancy places that have been mucking around this space for 50 years and have essentially lithium-ion batteries to show for cell phones, which have essentially zero application for connecting to the grid. So like you were crazy enough to say, all these really smart people never figured it out, but like, we've got a way.
Got it, yeah, makes sense. So, okay.
Why did you feel that way? That's not a normal thought to have.
Yeah, it's probably not a normal thought to have. So first of all, lithium-ion batteries do have an important role to play on the grid, a very important role. They're already being deployed. You know, all of the growth in the stationary grid-connected energy storage sector is occurring because of lithium-ion batteries. However, it was clear when we started the company that they were not going to solve the entire energy storage problem. And the reason that we had sort of the craziness or the audacity to go say, oh yeah, a lot of people are working on this for decades, but I think we can do better, is because we looked at sort of the fundamentals of the problem. We started from first principles and said, if you take a lithium-ion battery and you break it down into its raw materials, you look at the lithium, you look at the nickel, there's cobalt now, though that's likely going away in emerging battery chemistries. But a lot of these materials on just a per kilowatt hour of energy storage basis, they're too expensive to solve the long duration energy storage challenge. And so we said, you're gonna have to use a different material set, and you may have to use a different storage modality. So we looked across everything, not just electrochemical batteries, but also hydrogen, flow batteries, flywheels, compressed air, gravitational storage, and across all these different technology categories, we said, which ones from first principles have the capability to become the cheapest?
There's a lot of conversation right now about repatriation of manufacturing from overseas to the United States. What's coming to bear? I've heard major growth and investment in building out industrial real estate. What do you see coming down the pike in the next 5 to 10 years for industrial development in general and energy demand in the US?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most exciting things about the energy transition, particularly for the US. There are many exciting things. I think it's going to improve human well-being across the board. But particularly in the US, I think we have an opportunity for a major reindustrialization. And that is because if you look historically, industrialization has occurred where energy sources exist, right? So where are the industrial centers right now? Take the Gulf, for example, right? There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of oil and gas in the Gulf. And so a lot of manufacturing, a lot of heavy industry cropped up there. You look even further back at hydropower in the Northeast. Niagara Falls, a lot of industry cropped up because there was a lot of hydroelectric right there, right? In the future, that same trend will continue. Industry will follow cheap energy. And it just so happens that the cheapest energy now and certainly going forward will be in the sunniest places in the world and in the windiest places in the world. And in particular, the Midwest US has some of the best wind resource on Earth. So we really envision in the next 5, 10, 20 years, a reindustrialization of the American heartland driven by the availability of cheap, clean power.
If your batteries work and if wind and solar get connected to it and it works, we've basically developed this unbelievable, massive, new, cheap energy source in the United States that could drive this reindustrialization.
That's right. If you look at a global map of like the wind resource and the solar resource, like there are many places that are great on Earth that are very sunny or that are very windy. And in fact, solar is like incredibly widespread. Like people think, oh, it needs to be in like a desert, but like really solar is quite a scalable thing. It works to very northern and very southern latitudes. It's remarkably abundant. But if you look at a map of the whole world and you look at these resources, the Southwest US is one of the best places for solar. The Midwest US is one of the best places for wind. So they're clear places that would draw your eye as far as like, that's where I want to go build new power.
I remember a few years ago, energy independence was a big thing that I think both political parties talked about. And at least one of the directions people took that was it's a case for more drilling or more fracking or more development of hydrocarbon-based fuel. I wonder, is there a case that actually investing in renewables and storage systems is actually maybe one of the primary ways to drive energy independence? And in an emerging world order where there are friends and enemies around the world, like, is there a way that renewables actually becomes part of that play for national sovereignty and energy independence?
Yes, 100%. And I think this is actually one of the most exciting areas for like bipartisan consensus because the economics of wind and solar are now so good. It's clear that the interest of people who want to stop climate change and the interest of people who want to have national security and the interest of people who want to create good American jobs and have energy security, like all of these interests are aligned now for the first time in a bigger way than we've ever seen.
Because when I first hear about energy solutions that relate to wind and solar, part of my instinct is this is sort of United Nations overlords that are imposing carbon offsetting restrictions on companies. This is going to increase costs. This is going to drive business out of the countries that actually follow the rules. Big corporations are going to get around the rules. So much of me is like, I don't know, does this feel market driven? But it sounds like in the last few years, some of the underlying economics have really changed. Can you explain that a little bit?
I think we wouldn't have started the same company 10 or 15 years ago that we did now because the economics are just different. So if you look at the prices of wind and solar electricity, at the times when it's windy and sunny on the wholesale markets, those prices are just going down and down and down year after year.
And were there fundamental technology breakthroughs or just like slow economies of scale? What's explained the drop in price?
It's both. So I wouldn't say there was anything fundamental that changed. I think the technology has improved little by little. Efficiencies are going up. But I think it's also just manufacturing scale. We've deployed more wind and solar in the last decade than ever before. And so it's just, learning curves.
For people not super concerned about climate change, what is the case to them about why batteries could be really important for energy?
Yeah, this is what's so cool about this moment in history. It kind of doesn't matter what your motivations are. Batteries make sense no matter what. So if you're concerned about climate change, certainly deploying a lot of wind and solar with a lot of energy storage is the fastest path to decarbonizing our economy across the board. That is clear. But if you just want to make a bunch of money, deploying batteries is also now your best option. And that's because in many places in the US, there's wind and solar that's generating at very low cost when it's windy and sunny. And energy storage allows you to soak that up and then store it for later use that you would otherwise have bought a fossil fuel to create the energy for. So instead of buying that fossil fuel, you can soak up something that's basically free and abundant and then use it later. It happens to also be that process has zero emissions, so it's better for climate, but it's also just better for making money.
Let's say you were running an industrial manufacturing facility and you were choosing to go down the path of buying the wind battery option versus the coal option. Help me understand that funnel.
This has been a big point of education for a lot of the industrials that we work with. So if you're just looking at what are the existing options that I can buy right now, electrification of your industrial process doesn't look that attractive because right now in most places that power, that electricity is significantly more expensive than buying the natural gas to burn to create that heat. However, a lot of these manufacturers are also sitting right next to, say, a wind farm. And that wind farm is producing marginal kilowatt hours of electricity for near zero. And so meanwhile, the manufacturer is looking at all that near zero priced electricity, or sometimes actually zero priced electricity, and saying, gosh, I wish I could use that power. So the funnel is taking that power, which can be very, very inexpensive when it's abundant and when it's inexpensive, which is not every hour of the year. It's only during these periods of high generation, during a windstorm, for example. Taking that cheap power, soaking it up in some form of energy storage, and then letting that energy storage bleed out that energy in a controlled and continuous way so that the manufacturer can use it around the clock. The key there is that for the overall economics of that to work out, the energy storage system has to be extremely inexpensive so that when there is that big spike of wind power, you can soak it all up like a big sponge and hold it for as long as you need and then discharge it to ride out the periods when there is no wind blowing because it's a lull in the wind pattern.
My understanding is there are crazy federal, in some cases state, subsidies. Does the math still pencil if there's a situation where the subsidies go away?
Yes, it does. So the subsidies for wind and solar have been fantastic to sort of get these technologies spun up in the early years. And through the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing more subsidies for clean energy technologies, which is great. That's going to essentially accelerate the transition. But those are an accelerant, not a sort of fundamental of the market forces. I think if you look at the long time scales of this and you play out, 30, 40, 50 years in the future, it's clear that these are the best, lowest cost resources for us to be using, and the price of fossil fuels are likely to increase over time. The price of renewable energy is likely to decrease over time. It happens that we're right at this moment where that inflection is occurring and that crossover is occurring, And so the subsidies are a great accelerant that make that whole process happen faster, but they're it's sort of a kinetic argument, not a thermodynamic argument. The thermodynamics are renewable power is the cheapest form of energy on Earth.
A big challenge in a lot of the development in batteries is how we source what in some cases are rare earth metals, major concerns on human rights issues, on sourcing cobalt and some of these other things from emerging democracies in Africa, et cetera. Talk a little bit about the importance of landing on carbon as the main component in the battery.
Absolutely, yeah. This was a huge part of our sort of design criteria when we built the technology from the ground up. We said it can't have major supply chain constraints or minerals that are, constrained to being produced in only one geographic region or one country, or in a way that's creating human rights concerns. So that was one reason why carbon was so attractive to us. It's produced in large quantities on every continent of the Earth except for Antarctica, and it's already produced for other industries at massive scales. So the aluminum smelting industry, the steel production industry, these sectors already use these solid carbon materials for the production of aluminum and steel, and therefore it's already produced at tens of millions of tons per year. So that was a huge consideration in actually using carbon as a storage medium, in addition to the fact that it's physically just an incredibly good material for storing heat, and it's super low cost.
While carbon is an ethical, economical, and efficient material for Antora's energy storage system, other sectors rely heavily on critical minerals for energy storage, despite the unethical labor and environmental practices used to source them. However, in the small town of Collingwood, Ontario, we visited a group of scientists and engineers that are developing an entirely new way of harvesting these metals.
My name is Jason Gillum. I'm the CTO and co-founder here at Impossible Metals, and really responsible for the development of the robotics side of our business. And really keen to take you on a bit of a tour for showing you how we've built out the space and what we do here.
The folks at Impossible Metals are betting that they can responsibly mine the critical metals necessary for the energy transition. And they're getting them from the bottom of the ocean, using autonomous underwater robots.
The resource we're going after is called a polymetallic nodule. So it's a potato-sized rock that just lies on the seabed floor. So each one of these rocks has nickel, cobalt, copper, manganese, and some rare earth elements. These are all very important transition metals that we need to move away from fossil fuels. The nodules are the world's biggest resource of nickel and cobalt, and given that 71% of the surface area of our planet is ocean, it makes sense that it's a big resource. So Impossible Metals was really created to provide an alternative to the existing approaches of deep sea mining, which are basically using dredging and riser pump systems.
Deep sea dredging involves lowering a very large collector machine to the bottom of the ocean and vacuuming up the seabed floor, sending it up the riser tube system.
It's pretty bad because any of the life that's down there will be destroyed.
Impossible Metals' approach uses what's known as an autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV for short. It's a large, untethered, battery-powered robot that gently hovers above the seabed floor. Using an array of cameras, it identifies nodules and picks them up one by one. When the cameras detect visible life on or around the nodules, it chooses not to harvest it, maintaining the habitat behind the vehicle. It's important to note that while those animations are great at visualizing the difference between approaches, Impossible Metals is still a few years out from that vision. This is their current prototype, and it's called Eureka 1.
Through this gateway, that's where we move into the robotics side of our focus and where we're actually building the equipment, testing the equipment. So right now, Josh is lifting up the Eureka 1 AUV with the gantry crane that we've installed into the facility.
Eureka 1 is the prototype AUV they've developed to test their systems in shallow water, less than 100 feet deep. Their target depth for Eureka 2 is about 4 miles deep.
So next we'll take a look at the 1 degree of freedom test tank.
Here, they're measuring the amount of sediment disturbance the robot's claws will create.
This helps us really tune how deep we have to go in order to minimize the amount of sediment that gets resuspended. So the next tank that we can take a look at is the tow tank. And so that takes us from this sort of 1 degree of freedom motion to incorporate our vision system.
The vision system uses cameras to identify exactly where the nodules are located. Once the robot knows that, an algorithm drives the arms to selectively pick up the nodules.
Ultimately, the plan is to scale this to tens of arms on a single autonomous vehicle, and having tens and potentially hundreds of autonomous vehicles all operating together.
When we first came up with this concept, there was a lot of skepticism. Because it's relatively easy to create animations and describe what we're pursuing. But for 50 years, people have been building the dredging technology, and so there's a lot of skepticism. Recently, we invited some of the players to come and see the Eureka 1 trial, where it worked fully autonomously. I think people are beginning to realize that this architecture could work.
The technology itself is very much at the start of its development journey. One of the core focuses that we're really looking to differentiate ourselves with is that ability to pick up nodules one at a time and preserve the ecosystem, because we don't want to simply solve one environmental problem in exchange for another.
While commercial-scale polymetallic mining has yet to be greenlit by various global jurisdictions, it's encouraging to see groups like Impossible Metals building their solutions with responsibility at the forefront. Now, let's return to our in-studio conversation with Dr. Justin Briggs to continue our discussion on battery storage.
It's been interesting to look at how the media characterizes, in cases of SpaceX launches, an explosion or a failed launch. Hopefully you guys do not have an explosive moment literally, but I imagine there will be big failures along the way. How do you think about handling those major setbacks in this controversial and dangerous business that you're building?
Yeah, well, I think the first and most important thing is that we don't think it's controversial or dangerous. And that was by design. Because we're storing energy as heat already, you can't really have a rapid release of that heat energy in an explosion, because what is an explosion or a fire? An explosion or a fire is when you take energy that's stored in one way, like chemical bonds, and you convert it rapidly to energy in the form of heat. But our energy is already sitting there in the form of heat, so it's sort of already in the final resting place. And further, the storage medium that we're using, which is solid carbon, doesn't burn. You can hold a blowtorch up to this stuff and it will not set on fire, which we've done, actually. We've even doused it in lighter fluid and held a blowtorch up to it, and it will not start on fire. I mean, the lighter fluid burns off, but the solid carbon just sits there and won't burn. But nonetheless, your question is still good. There still will be hiccups, there'll be malfunctions. Engineering setbacks are actually good and to be expected and will help us learn faster.
Tell me about delivering the first working prototype. I hope it involved some mishaps, but what was that like? How did the install go? There are always challenges in launching the first beta product.
Yeah. Finally, this year we turned on our pilot unit out in Fresno County, California. There were absolutely mishaps here and there. When you turn something on for the first time, you always have unexpected things happening. But it largely has been a successful turn on so far, and we're still getting it up to speed and taking all the initial data off it. So it's actually unfolding like in real time as we speak. We're working around the clock to put it through its paces and make sure that it works exactly as we expected, and make sure we understand any way that it deviates from expected operation.
Pathway to 100 sites. What are the major barriers you're gonna have to overcome to get there?
The first is financing. Fortunately, there's a lot of energy and momentum around solutions for the energy transition right now, like thermal energy storage. But nonetheless, getting financing for the first 5 projects that we do is going to be hard. You want to get a bank to sign up to back these things. Banks are risk averse, and inherently there is risk in a new technology. That's one piece. The other is manufacturing scale up, and we don't currently have the capability to do that. So we're right now just spinning up a new manufacturing facility to do this, but that's going to be a really heavy lift over the coming year as we get the facility set up and then get it turned on and start pumping out thermal storage units.
So if this happens quickly, what happens to the fossil fuel reserves? Do they just stay in the earth and the price is really high and they're heavily regulated, and so they're just there and nothing ever happens to them?
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine a scenario where they wouldn't even need to be heavily regulated because they're just not economically competitive anymore. You know, it's like already this is happening with coal. People are using less coal because it's just more expensive to create electricity with coal. Wind and solar and natural gas to some extent are just more cost-effective options. And I think the economics are going to continue to drive that trend. So, you know, people are going to look at coal and natural gas and oil in the ground like they look at dinosaur bones in the ground. It's like it's a thing that's in the ground that is not really helpful to our energy economy.
And what seems like an overture from you, if you're putting on your granola environmentalist Colorado roots hat to the side of industry, is you're excited to see cheap, ubiquitous, low-cost energy for what it can do for industrialization. I mean, there are not that many environmentalists championing a new age of industrialization. So you, in how you talk about these things, seem like have, I imagine, allies on both sides.
Definitely, and I think in the future, like there will be more and more allies on both sides. The reason is that historically there's been this sort of opposition between like, you know, manufacturing and industry and, you know, building the things that we use every day, and then sort of like the environmental movement and minimalism and using fewer resources. And like, I'm a big believer in both of those things. Like I want to protect the earth. I want to protect the open and natural spaces we have. I want to protect people and make sure they have healthy air and healthy water. I also want to make sure that we have a flourishing economy and that people have jobs and that all the things that we use, our clothes, our cars, this table, like all those things have to be made somehow. And industry is what makes those for us. And all the prosperity that we've experienced as a civilization, in fact, the prosperity that I experienced and the privilege that allows me to say, hey, like, let's work on the energy transition, that was born out of the fossil fuel industry and heavy industry that built our whole economy. So I'm grateful that happened, and I want the rest of the world, the developing world who hasn't yet had that privilege, to also share in the bounty of energy in the future. But I think those things can happen simultaneously, and the key to driving that reindustrialization of this country in providing abundant and clean energy to everybody on Earth, and in protecting the climate and protecting human well-being, the key to doing all that is unlocking wind and solar.
When you're thinking about spraying this new miracle, cheap, clean, low-cost energy around the world, what's on your mind about making sure low-income, emerging markets, adults, children have access to this?
It's not that hard to envision a future where we get it right. Like in the past, when we're using fossil fuels, you know, it's great that we can burn those fossil fuels to get all that cheap and abundant energy so we can, you know, build roads and build manufactured goods and all that. But it's really too bad that we're just polluting heavily while doing it. For the most part, the energy future that I see is one where there's just naturally not a lot of these externalities. Like wind and solar naturally don't have a lot of emissions that wreck the water quality or the air quality. Our thermal batteries are similar. There's nothing that comes out of these boxes that's polluting the world. It's just, it gets hot, it gets cool, that's all that happens. I think probably the biggest area where we're gonna have to be careful is on resource extraction. So no matter what, if we're building physical objects, solar panels, wind turbines, thermal batteries, we're gonna need materials to do that. And in the long future, and I think we're probably gonna go back and mine our landfills for all the valuable minerals that we've been depositing there, but that's not gonna happen for a long time. So in the next several decades, we're gonna continue extracting resources from the earth, and that's gonna be a necessary part of the energy transition. But exactly where and how we do that, I think, will be important. So I think that's gonna be the hardest thing to solve for. But I also think that it's an absolutely solvable problem. We can get all the minerals, all the resources that we need in a way that is sustainable long-term and does not hurt the most vulnerable people.
I love the way that Alex Epstein describes energy. He describes it as food for robots. And so think about if we have this dramatic new supply of food for robots, cheap, free, ubiquitous, healthy food for robots, what that could mean for a renaissance of manufacturing. I mean, at the very least, it means we become competitive in global labor market, and so the repatriation stuff doesn't have to only be begotten through crazy political pressures or subsidies, so we could compete on the real terms. But I don't know, do you have any thoughts on if energy were essentially near zero, what would that do to our ability to make things or create things? Like, what do you think could happen?
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite thought experiments. I think another way to phrase this is when energy is cheap enough, everything becomes an energy problem, right? If you just have abundant, low-cost, clean electricity available all the time, then the sky's the limit on what you can do. And it's certainly the manufacturing sector. You know, we think that deep electrification of manufacturing will absolutely occur. Basically, every process will fundamentally be driven by electricity from wind and solar, buffered through a thermal battery. But it's already transforming the transportation industry. We think it's in the process of transforming the grid. The built environment is also very clearly on the path to being deeply electrified with, you know, heat pumps for low temperature heating applications, electric cooktops, like all of these things are well on their way. But then you start getting really crazy and asking, what else could you do? You know, when energy is cheap enough, water becomes an energy problem, right? Desalination, all of a sudden, once expensive and energy intensive, now if you've got free solar power all the time, maybe it's not so bad. So I mean, we really view it as something that will across the board transform the way we think about our energy economy.
Earlier, you talked about the possible bipartisan partnerships that could be emerging here. When I think about the tension between the fossil fuel people and the renewable people, I think about Donald Trump and Greta Thunberg. It feels like oil and water. What have you seen recently happening that gives you hope that there's kind of a consensus coming together?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that some of the major players in industry and energy are just making big moves to move towards a solution that is economically viable and better for the climate. And they're doing that because it's the right business decision, but it also has the benefit of being the right climate decision. So a couple of great examples are a couple of our investors are Shell and BHP. So some of the biggest oil and gas and mining and minerals companies in the world. They clearly see the writing on the wall that the way they're doing things it's not a sustainable business model because of a resource and climate perspective, but it's just not an economically viable business model long term. And they understand that moving away from the rising prices and volatility of fossil fuels will benefit them economically. So I think the fundamental driving force here is just the market dynamics. Like, we think that the scale of solution that will actually stop climate change will only be achieved when it's economically viable. So that's why we founded the company as we did, because we said, this can't be something that floats on subsidies only. This can't be something that people adopt because they are climate enthusiasts. It has to be something that they adopt because it's the right business decision. That's when it's going to achieve the level of scale. And so that's the thing that really brings people across the spectrum together. It makes money, it creates jobs, it stops climate change, it improves human well-being. It's really a win-win-win.